Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we look at your word. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. We're in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus has been established as the Christ. And what does it mean to say, according to Luke, what does it mean to say that Jesus is the Christ? How does he demonstrate himself to be Christ? Christos, Messiah.
He heals.
He heals. He does miracles. He teaches. He
heals.
All this heals, casts out demons. Miracle worker, feeds big crowds, walks on water. All of which show him to be the Christ. And then he starts moving towards Jerusalem. So Luke establishes him as the Christ. And in fact, if you look at Mark and Matthew, it's the same pattern. Establishes the Christ, confession at Caesarea Philippi, boom, we're moving to something else. Because these guys are organizing the story in a way that makes sense. Chronology may not be the motivating factor for any of the evangelists. It just isn't. They're structuring their stories in a way that's meaningful to the people who are not reading them but hearing them. Because people aren't reading all that much. There's not much to read. So they're hearing it, and so they're structuring it so it'll be meaningful as they hear it. Now, so he's heading to Jerusalem, and he's preparing disciples for the time he's gone. Gets to Jerusalem, right? And that's where we've been the last 2 weeks. And when he gets into Jerusalem, what does he start doing in the temple? As Luke kind of structures his work, what is Jesus doing in the temple?
He's kind of clearing it out.
He kind of
letting them deal with.
Yeah, it's kind of almost like a final showdown, because the opposition is there, and who are the opposition? That was me,
Okay.
But it wasn't your fault. It was mine. Who is the opposition? Who's the? Okay, you got Pharisees, you got Sadducees, you got scribes. They are there, and in the temple, he kind of knocks them down, right? Because he deals with the scribes and the Pharisees, and he deals with the Sadducees. Okay, so final teaching in the temple, Jesus is done. Last week, at least his teaching, last week we talked about the beginning of his passion. And how does the passion begin?
Was it triumphal entry into certainly Palm Sunday? Is the passion?
Well, Palm Sunday, a little bit before, what starts the immediate passion story?
Passover.
Passover, the meal, right? Shares a meal with his disciples, right? And in Luke it's a little longer than in the others, although it's much longer in John. Matthew and Mark, it's briefer. Jesus in this establishes communion, or at least as Luke is shaping the story, it's a sacrament that they're familiar with. Jesus goes, remember he prays, but that's a little different in Luke. Although there's anguish, the disciples come off looking a little better in Luke. In Mark, they fall asleep 3 times. In Luke, they fall asleep once, but he gives a reason they fall asleep. That they are overwhelmed with grief. And then when the crowd comes to arrest Jesus, the disciples, in Mark, the disciples run away. In Luke, what do the disciples do? Draw a sword. One draws a sword, cuts off the ear. So the disciples are far more active and less frightened in Luke. Again, makes sense since Luke is going to have Acts where the disciples play an enormous role. So he doesn't want to undermine their credibility in the gospel since they are going to be the founders of the church later. So it's consistent if we take Luke and Acts as one work. Okay, so we've got that Jesus is arrested. Where is he taken after he's arrested? Okay, well he's heading to Pilate, right? Initially he's taken where?
To the council.
To the council. And what happens with the council?
They ask him if he's the Messiah.
Okay, and
You
does,
say I am.
yes. Now, what appears to be the motivate, now the council's made up of people that want to kill him, right? And we knew that right from the beginning. What does it appear that the council wants to get on Jesus? What's going to enable, at least as Luke tells the story, what's going to enable the council to fulfill its goal of killing Jesus?
Him saying he's the king of the Jews.
Okay, and why is that going to be a problem? For Jesus, why is that going to enable the council to do what it's wanted to do from the miracle of the man with the withered hand?
The only king, Caesar.
Because that's right, and that means they can take Jesus where? To Pilate, and let the Romans kill him. Remember, I told you one of the problems that Christians dealt with, the early church dealt with, is Jesus dies on a Roman cross. He doesn't die by Jewish execution. He's not stoned. So how can the Messiah of the Jews, if the Jews are responsible for his death, why would he die on a Roman cross? That's an issue that the early church is trying to explain, just like why is Jesus baptized? That's an issue. Clearly it's part of the tradition, but it's not obvious just looking at it, why he would die on a Roman cross.
Why did he die on the Roman cross?
Well, that's what he's dealing with here. The explanation, we'll look at the explanation, at least how Luke views it. Luke is also, remember we talked about it, and just file away, Luke tends to be pretty easy on the Romans. He doesn't come down real hard on the Romans. Again, makes a lot of sense. Churches around the turn of the first century, they're facing opposition from the Jews. They're the enemies of the early church. The Romans are not yet. And if you want to shut this little bitty church down, tick off the Romans. Get the Romans mad at you. So Luke has a lot of motivation to have the blame rest on the Jews rather than on the Romans. And so that's kind of behind how he shapes his story a little bit. Okay, so we've got Jesus. They think they've got him, right? The council says, man, we have got him. We've trumped out charges. We're going to take him to Pilate. And that's where we start in chapter 23. They take him to Pilate. He's been before the council. They take him to Pilate. And in the conclusion of their investigation by the council is that Jesus is what? Why are they taking him now to Pilate?
Trying to get the people to ride.
Because,
pay taxes.
okay, good. That's going to be the charge. Now, who is Pilate? Just so that we're all on the same page.
Is he a governor?
Okay, he's governor. What kind of governor? Who does he represent? Roman. He's a Roman governor. Because Judea is a province, not a kingdom. When Herod was king, it was a kingdom protected by the Romans. Now it's a province governed by the Romans. And Pilate is the governor. His capital, and we see that in Acts, his capital is a place called Caesarea, right on the Mediterranean. Makes sense that the Roman governor would have his capital right on the Mediterranean Sea. Why would that make sense? Why would that travel? I mean, he could get in and out of his capital. Jerusalem is a bad place to make your capital if you're a Roman governor. Why is Jerusalem a really bad place? Can't get away from it. You know, Jerusalem is on top of a mountain, surrounded by walls. If trouble breaks out and you're in Caesarea, you can get on a boat and sail. And you can sail the troops in. If you're in Jerusalem in this trouble, you are in trouble. You're in trouble. Deep trouble. Even though it's high. You're in high trouble. Okay, but Pilate would go to Jerusalem once a year. When would Pilate go to Jerusalem?
Passover.
He'd go Passover. Why would Pilate and a whole cohort of Roman soldiers go to Jerusalem during Passover? What would motivate them from leaving their comfortable little town, their comfortable little city in Caesarea, and going to this very dangerous, isolated place, Jerusalem? Why would they do that at Passover? Why would the Roman governor and a squad of Roman soldiers be in Jerusalem at Passover? What would scare the Romans? What would concern the Romans?
Any kind of uprising.
Any kind of uprising. And why then would you put the governor and soldiers in Jerusalem at Passover?
Keep peace.
Ooh, yeah, well, you got a religious holiday. Jews coming to Jerusalem for Passover from all over the world for this celebration at the temple. If you were going to have something break out, it's going to be at Passover. You got a lot of people in the city, a lot of Jews, if you wanted to stir up trouble. So the Romans just wanted to be present there for Passover. So Pilate is there and his little soldiers, not usually there. He's not in Jerusalem very often, but he's there now. They take him to Pilate, and what do they accuse him of? What's the charge? And you just said it a minute ago. He's king of the Jews. What else is he doing?
Not paying the taxes.
He's encouraging people not to be. He's perverting the nation, encouraging people to not pay the taxes. He's claiming to be king. Now, why are these the charges the Jewish council's bringing?
They want to influence Rome.
These are politically charged charges. I mean, these charges would really bother the Romans. For us, the reader, when we hear the charges that they offer, what do we know as they rattle off these charges? I mean, there's a certain irony in these charges, right? Because did Jesus teach you shouldn't pay taxes?
No.
Heck no. Remember, he was the one that said, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So he never taught that. Did Jesus in his interrogation ever claim to be the Messiah, the Christ? Heck no, he didn't. So he didn't do any of this. Now, this is something really important for Luke, and we're going to see it in just a little bit, that Jesus is innocent of the charges that are being brought.
Well, Rome's not going to care that he's healing on the Sabbath.
And he doesn't care about
any of that religious.
Right. The only thing that would bother the Romans about healing on the Sabbath is if the Jews got all fired up about it and stopped paying taxes. That would bother the Romans. But they don't care. They don't care that he claims he's Son of God. They don't care. As long as it doesn't cause the Jews to get fired up and, sort of an incitement to riot. So these are charges brought. We know he's innocent. What does Pilate say? What does Pilate ask Jesus?
If he is a king,
Are you king of the Jews? Because this is a big deal. If he's claiming to be king, that's a problem for the Romans, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does Jesus answer?
You say so.
You say so, which is
You said
a non-answer. That he's not claiming to be king, right?
Yep.
Now, based on that one question, what is Pilate's conclusion?
He doesn't find any fault.
He doesn't find any fault. Now, if we're just looking at Luke's story, we're not looking at anything else, what conclusion do we reach about Pilate here?
I reach he's passing the buck.
Well, he's passed. Is Pilate presented as a person who wants to kill Jesus?
No.
He's not. As a matter of fact, if
He washes
anything,
his hands, doesn't he?
well, if anything, Pilate wants to do what? Later in this story. Wants to let him go. Pilate wants to let Jesus go. So Pilate, now why would Luke be so conscious of this? Why would he present Pilate? Remember, he's going to be nailed to a Roman cross. Why is it so important for Luke to make sure this is how we see Pilate? The people hearing this story, this is how they see Pilate.
Because he's not the one that's going to cause his death.
He is not the one to cause his death. Who's to blame? For his death. The scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're the ones. Because when Pilate says, I've got no reason for doing that, what's the response of the people around?
Says they were
Okay,
insistent.
they are fired up, right? And he says that they are, and again, remember, they're saying this in front of the Roman governor. In verse 5, what do they say he's doing?
Stirring up the people.
He's stirring up the people,
By teaching.
which the Romans don't want anyone to
Stir
up the people, and they sure don't want anybody stirring up the people on Passover, because now you got a big problem. A lot of people to be stirred up, and now you got a big riot. Now, what does Pilate ask? So the Jews are playing this game. What does Pilate ask?
And Jesus was a
Are you a
Galilean.
Galilean? Now, this is unique in Luke. Luke is the only one that deals with this stuff. And what does he do after he gets his answer?
That he's under Herod's jurisdiction, so he sends him away.
Okay, sends him to Herod. Now, again, as the reader, we know that Jesus is not a Galilean because Jesus was born
A Jew.
he was raised in Nazareth, but he was born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is not in Galilee. So Jesus is not a Galilean. He was born in Judea. So again, we know that even this is false. So we've got Jesus being accused of things he didn't do or he didn't say, and even this is not true because Jesus isn't a Galilean, even though he was raised in Nazareth. We, the reader, know. So Pilate says, let's send him to Herod. Now, who is Herod?
King.
Okay, Herod is it's kind of interesting. Herod is like a sub-king. He was, in Greek, what's called a tetrarch. Anarchos means king, refers to king. And tetra is 3. So he's like a third of a king. So he is a sort of a king second class. Now his father Herod the Great was king. But his sons,
Which were named Herod.
which were all named Herod, they were thirds of a king. So he had jurisdiction working under the Romans over a little area. So he wasn't recognized as a full king. He was one of Herod's sons that Herod named Herod. Even his girls he named Herodias. So Herod really liked his name. So Herod is, now why is Herod in Jerusalem? Because he's the tetrarch of Galilee. Why is he in Jerusalem?
Passover, I guess.
Passover. Now what's interesting about Herod, all the Herods, is the Herods were Jews by religion, but weren't Jews by race. Herod, they were Edomians. They were descendants of Edom. They were Edomites. And Edom were supposed to be, or believed to be, they believed themselves to be descendants of Esau, not of Jacob. So they weren't children of Israel. They were descendants from Esau. That's how they traced their heritage. But they weren't ethnic Jews. But they were Jewish in terms of what they worshipped. Now, that was fine for Pharisees. It really ticked the Sadducees off, the fact that they weren't ethnically Jews. And it's interesting, Herod Antipas will have a son, and his son will be raised in Rome. So he's going to be real close to the Romans. In fact, he's going to be named, I've lost it, Herod Agrippa, because Agrippa was a great Roman general. His name's going to be Herod Agrippa. They were sucking up to the Romans. And he's going to be placed, he's going to be made a king. Anyway, Herod Agrippa, what he did was he made a palace in Jerusalem. And because he was given, the Romans gave him, he was a king, gave him authority over Judea, no more Roman governors. And what Herod Agrippa did, his palace, he built his palace in Jerusalem across the court from the temple and made at the second floor a dining hall for he and his guests on the second floor of his palace. And what they could do is they could oversee the sacrifices being performed in the temple, because the sacrifices were being in an altar in a courtyard, and he could see the sacrifices. But he wasn't a Jew by race. And what the Sadducees did, because they didn't like the fact that Herod was doing that, is they built a wall in front of Herod's palace. So instead of being able to look at the sacrifices, all they could see was a wall, because non-Jews were not supposed to participate in the sacrifices. So this is Herod Antipas. He's a Jew by religion but not of race. He is in Jerusalem. Herod receives Jesus, right? Pilate sends Herod to Jesus. How does Herod receive him? What is Herod's feeling when Jesus shows up?
Oh, he's excited.
Okay, he's really excited. Now remember, Herod has a little backstory with John the Baptist. What does Herod end up doing with John the Baptist? Beheads John the Baptist. And it's about the fact that he married his brother's wife. It was something you see in Young and the Restless.
Now, is Herod the one that sings, "You're Jesus Christ"?
Yes, and Jesus Christ superstar. So Herod is, now it says Herod's excited to see him. We've got Pilate saying he's innocent. Herod is excited about seeing him. What impression what's our initial impression of Herod? Yeah, kind of, is he one of the scribes and the Pharisees? No. I mean, he's happy. He's superficial, because why does he want to see him?
He wants to see him do something.
He wants to see him do something. And Herod questions him, right? And how does Jesus respond?
No answer.
No answer. Now, that's significant, because if you look at Isaiah, the passage about, the before the shearer of the lamb, before the shearer is silent. So it's sort of a fulfillment of Old Testament. Remember I told you, Luke has a lot of Old Testament stuff, he just doesn't reference it. He's silent in front of Herod, but who is not silent? Because Jesus isn't alone when he goes.
The chief priests and the scribes.
The chief priests and the scribes, they are
Accusing him.
very, very vocal, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what does Herod end up doing?
Mocking him.
Okay, they end up mocking him. And how do they mock him? What's the mocking that they do?
It's put on a robe on him and act like he's the king.
Okay, they put a robe on him and act like he's king. Now, as the reader, there's a little irony here, right? That Herod's treating him like a king. For one, Herod's a king. Treating Jesus like a king. Is Herod doing something that's appropriate? By treating him like a king? Herod doesn't think so, right? But we, the reader, is Herod doing something that's appropriate and he doesn't realize it? Yeah, he is. Because Jesus is a king. That's what irony is. Herod is doing the right thing, but he doesn't know it. But we, the reader, know it, because we, the reader, know that he's king. So he puts a robe on Jesus. What does he do with Jesus?
Sends him back to Herod.
Now, he sends him back to Herod. Now, Pilate. Why would he send him back to Pilate? What would that show about Herod's judgment towards Jesus?
That he doesn't want to find him guilty.
He doesn't want to find him guilty either. So neither Pilate nor Herod see Jesus as someone that needs to be dealt with. Mocked, sure. Killed, not so much. So Herod bumps him back to Pilate. And just so that we recognize that Herod and Pilate are on the same page as it relates to Jesus, what does Luke tell us?
They became friends.
They became besties.
What's
They
that-
became
I don't understand-
BFFs.
I don't understand that. What's that about? Why?
Well, why right after both of them make this judgment about Jesus, neither one want to kill him, in spite of the fact that the real villains, the enemies, pushing that hard, right? Why would Luke right after that say, after this they became good friends? What might Luke be very subtly communicating?
Their unified front.
They have something in common now. Didn't have anything in common before, but now they have this in common. Neither one want to kill Jesus. Neither one. By doing that, what has Luke done to both Pilate and Herod? Kind of softened it a little bit.
That made them responsible.
Yeah, now again, we know who's going to be responsible. It's not going to be Herod. It's not going to be Pilate. It's going to be...
That's right. The teachers of the law.
It's going to be the teachers of the law. They're the ones to be blamed.
What makes the teachers of the law of Moses so all-powerful?
Well, now, that's a great question, Ed. Their power really, they weren't nearly as strong when this is occurring as they will be later. The reason is Jerusalem is centered around the temple. So temple worship is the core of Judaism. That's what it meant to be a Jew. You sacrificed at the temple. And the group around the temple were the high priests and the Sadducees. Because the Sadducees were the ones that kind of protected temple worship. The Pharisees weren't. Although the Pharisees saw temple worship as important, they saw of equal importance following not just the law from the first 5 books, but all the other laws that developed from those laws. If you look at the law in the Old Testament, the Torah, the first 5 books, thou shalt not kill, right? Don't kill. 10 Commandments in the Torah. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you can't kill ever? Well, what happens when you're in fighting? What happens in a war? Are soldiers allowed to kill?
Yeah.
I've heard the hair split before that it says do not murder.
Well, that's one of the ways you start defining it. What you end up doing is you have to start breaking it down, right? Thou shalt not steal. Well, what if you kill somebody by accident? What if you're chopping wood, the axe gets loose and kills somebody? Well, you have to develop laws, right? To separate intention, to start judging intention.
That's murder too, no intent.
Yeah, that's right. Because homicide.
Premeditated.
And that's what they did. In fact, that's what Paul says in Galatians is the problem with the law. You can't have just one. Once you have one law, you got to have 3 more to explain the one law. And as soon as you have 3 more, you need 3 more for each one of those to explain those laws. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now the Pharisees became more and more focused on the law, not only in the first 5 books, but also in the prophets. And they started scouring the books to find what people should be doing. The Sadducees weren't nearly as interested in that as performing the sacrifices, because that's what they valued. Something really traumatic happened in the year 71 that changed everything about Judaism. What happens in the year 71? What the Romans were dreading occurred, and the Jews rebel against the Romans. And so you have a rebellion against the Romans in Jerusalem and Judea that the Romans have to send an army to put down, which they do. And one of the things they do, because the rebellion was centered around the temple and those who worshipped at the temple. When the Romans put the rebellion down, what do you think the Romans did to the temple?
Destroyed it.
Tore it down. And what's ironic is the temple had only been it had been rebuilt by Herod the Great and had only been finished for about 10 years when the Romans tore it down. because that was no longer going to be a symbol to unite the Jews against us. What the Pharisees, because they were focused on obeying the law, that's all the Pharisees wanted. So the Romans and the Jews and the Sadducees disappear because there's no temple worship. So you only had Pharisees left. And the Pharisees were happy to just obey their laws and be left alone. And the Romans were delighted to have the Pharisees just obey their laws and to leave them alone as long as they were
Quiet.
Quiet and paying taxes. As long as the Pharisees paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble, the Romans were
Fine with it.
fine with it. And that's why Judaism becomes this law-centered Pharisaic religion rather than one centered on the temple, because the temple's torn down. And those who believed in temple worship believed that you could only have one temple, and that had to be in Jerusalem. And the Romans said, we're not giving you a building permit, because if we do, you're going to rebel again.
Yeah.
And so tore down the wall, tore down the temple, and Judaism becomes this Pharisaic Judaism. That's the only thing left. Okay, and that's why they're the drivers. That's why the Sadducees play such a little role in the story of the Passion in all of the Gospels, because the audience that's reading this, they don't know anything about Sadducees. They hadn't existed, when Luke wrote this, they hadn't existed for 20 years. There hadn't been a Sadducee.
They just died off.
They died, well, once you didn't have a temple, there's no reason to defend it.
So I wonder where they went.
Well,
They're at the Church of God. on
yes,
Down
that's
Street.
right. They became Unitarians.
Yeah.
Second Church of God.
But as a movement, they cease to exist. And that's why it's so focused on Pharisee. Now, the Gospel of John, he talks about the enemy being the Jews, which kind of indicates that there's a radical separation between Christians and Jews. So, but that's not here. So we've got the people who want to kill him, right? Pilate doesn't want to do it. Herod doesn't want to do it. But Jesus is back with Pilate, right? And what happens when Jesus gets back to Pilate? What's the situation? Who is there?
The outlaws.
We've got this Aklos. We've got the people. They weren't there before. Now, remember, how did the chief priests and the leaders, how did they view the people? How did they view the people?
Well, they're kind of afraid of them.
They're afraid of them because the people have always been there. You know, they were the ones that ate the food. They were the ones that saw the miracle. They were always in the background. And the people who wanted to kill Jesus were kind of afraid of him. That's why they didn't arrest him at the temple, because they thought the people would object to it, right? So they are now there. So the plot thickens as Luke is telling this story. They bring Jesus to Pilate. What does Pilate say to him?
He said he's examined him and he's not found him guilty and
Yep.
no charges, and neither's Herod.
Neither Herod nor I find any reason to put him to death. Kind of ironic that he's being accused of perverting the people. And who is standing there? The people are standing there. So if he was perverting the people, Jesus did a pretty lousy job of doing it, because the people are standing there beside the chief priests and the leaders. Now, what does Pilate offer to sort of soothe their upset feelings?
To flog him.
Okay, going to flog him. And what is flogging?
Nasty.
Beat him with a whip.
Okay, you beat him with a whip. It was kind of bad because they put little pieces of metal and glass in knots in the whip. So it was a pretty bad thing. Now it's interesting, and just file this away, that why would Pilate say that he would flog Jesus, he'd have Jesus flogged, if he knew he was innocent?
To acquiesce.
Okay, compromise, right? You know, I want to turn him loose, you want him crucified, let's come to the middle.
Let's wrap them up a little.
Yeah, and we'll rough him up a little bit. Now, what's really interesting, in the Gospel of Luke, there's no indication that he was flogged. Unlike the other Gospels, there's no mention of him being flogged in Luke. Now, again, what might be Luke's motivation in not having Jesus flogged? If Mark has it, and remember it said that Luke had Mark in front of him, and it's sort of reshaping the story.
I don't think he wants to lose focus
Okay.
on who.
Okay, good. And who is accountable and who isn't.
Yeah.
And it ain't the Romans.
Yeah, he doesn't want to muddy the water.
Doesn't want to muddy the water. He also doesn't want to come down too hard on the Romans. Because if he comes down too hard on the Romans are going to come down on him and his little community.
Are they still under Roman control at that time?
Oh,
Absolutely. So there's no benefit to a struggling church to pick a fight with Rome when Luke's writing this to them.
No. And in fact, when you look at all four of the Gospels, given the fact that Jesus is nailed to a cross, the Romans come off looking fairly decent. Really good in Luke. Probably better in Luke than the others. But pretty good.
I could tell you, we had the best tour guide at the Colosseum.
Oh.
This Italian guy. And he goes into it, and it's funny because he'd just go on and on about how great Rome was, then the barbarians came. Like trying to tell you, what was happening at the Colosseum was great, and beautiful, and this and that, even though they were slaughtering people, and then the barbarians. It's funny because he kept thinking that. But I have to look, I think Casey captured it. We were recording him, and he says, that I forget what emperor it was, says, these Christians have really not done anything bad, and how Rome accepts Christianity, but it cracks me up. Like, they put a real, he put a real pro-Roman Rome slant on things. It's hilarious.
Well, and I think that's what Luke is doing. He's putting a pro-Roman and a pro-establishment because Herod is sort of let off the hook a little bit.
And I think Rome doesn't care. As long as they're getting their money, worship whoever you want. But pay your bills.
What's interesting is that when Rome started persecuting Christians, and you start getting around the 1st century, the beginning. Now, what happened in Rome with Nero, that's not systematic. They were local. You had local persecutions of Christians, but then you had local persecutions of everybody. But it didn't become systematic until much later. And we're talking maybe 100 years later. And the reason the Romans started persecuting Christians had nothing to do with what Christians, that's a little strong. It had nothing to do with the person Christians worship. Had nothing to do with Jesus Christ. The Romans persecuted Christians, and it had nothing to do with the fact that Christians saw Jesus as Son of God. Nothing. They persecuted Christians because Christians weren't patriotic. What the Romans would do, Romans were, the big temple, you were in Rome. The big temple that's still in Rome is called, did you visit the Pantheon? Do you know what the word Pantheon means?
Many, God, yeah.
Yeah, God. The Pantheon was a temple for, Pan is all. Pantheon is a temple for all gods. And that's what it was. You had altars to all the gods they could find in the Pantheon. Because the Romans had no problem with people worshiping other gods. In the Pantheon, they'd have been happy to put an altar to Jesus. It would have made them happy. What the Romans did, what they did was they used religion as a way to unify the empire. We will accept what you believe, so long as you are also a good Roman, as long as you recognized what other people were worshiping. We were all worshiping different gods, but we're going to worship them together. We're going to worship them together in the Pantheon, in little cities. We're going to worship them together by having joint sacrifices. And so you'd have a time when the whole city would get together, perform sacrifices to different gods, including sacrifices for the emperor. This was a civic gathering. And afterwards, everybody in the town, and it didn't matter who you worshiped, would eat the meat that was sacrificed, and it would be a big party, and everybody would feel good about being Roman. Because Romans would accept all these other religions as long as you accepted one another. What's the problem with Christians?
They don't want to do
They
that.
won't go to the stupid festivals. They won't eat the meat offered to other gods. Now, the Jews were given an exception until the temple fell. As long as the Jews sacrificed for the emperor in the temple, they were sort of excused from the civic service. When the Pharisees became dominant, they were excused as long as they just stayed by themselves and didn't cause trouble. Because the Romans didn't want to stir up problems. So let the Pharisees be in their own little communities with their own little laws, paying taxes. But Christians, they were Gentile. They weren't Jews anymore. And so Christians were living in the city of Ephesus. And so when you have this big celebration in Ephesus to unite the people in the town to support the Roman Empire, Christians did what? They stayed home. And the Romans said, that's not patriotic. It's like somebody kneeling when the national anthem is played. That's what the Romans said. That Christians were kneeling during the national anthem. They wouldn't participate in this. Therefore, Christians were dangerous and needed to be taught a lesson. And that's when you start getting systematic persecution. It wasn't about their religion. Well, it was what the religion led them to do. There was only one God, so you couldn't recognize others. It was that they weren't patriotic enough. And that the Romans couldn't allow that. Because once you allowed one group to do it, then another group is going to do it. And then another group, and then what unified the empire is gone. Is gone. Everybody wants to do their own thing. Now you got a problem. And that became the issue for the Romans. So here we've got, we're not at that point yet even in Luke's community. So he's before Pilate, right? And Pilate says, I'll flog him, but in Luke he never gets around to doing it. Now, what's the tradition?
Release a prisoner.
Going to release a prisoner. Okay? And what do the people say?
Give us Barabbas.
Okay.
Barabbas.
That give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas is an interesting person with an interesting name. What is his backstory? Because Luke tells us who Barabbas is.
Says he's a murderer and
He's
in
charged.
prison for insurrection.
He's in prison for an insurrection. Boy, are we talking about irony, right? Because the Jews want Jesus killed because he's stirring up the people against Rome, right? Claims to be king, stirring up the people. And who's Barabbas?
He started the riot.
He is doing
Yeah,
it.
he's
You know.
doing it, killing, murdered.
Yes, but he's not just a murderer. He's starting an insurrection. He's stirring people up
to get that Jesus.
to overthrow Rome. And Jesus isn't. Now, he is really guilty of what they're charging Jesus. What's also interesting is his name, Barabbas. In Hebrew, Barabbas means, this is what it means literally, the son of a father. That's what Barabbas means, son of a father. Now, when you're looking at your little baby down in your arms and figuring out what you're going to name him, are you going to name your baby son of a father?
No?
Who is a son of a father?
Everyone.
Everybody. And so the fact that Barabbas is the one they choose, not George, not Oscar, not Simon, but Barabbas, son of a father. It's almost like Luke, and this is we see in all of the four Gospels, it's almost like Luke is saying anybody. They would have chosen anybody other than Jesus.
Huh.
It's just an odd name. The Barabbas isn't a name that a lot of people had because what it means is,
I thought maybe it meant like nothing, like boy. Like you never got a name, it was just boy.
literally
The parents never bothered to give them an identity, just.
well, and that certainly could be
Yeah.
there. It's interesting that that's the one they chose. You know, the son of a father. Son of a father. Okay, so does Pilate want him crucified? Does Pilate want to release Barabbas instead of Jesus?
Nope.
Luke even says it in the narrative that Pilate wanted to release Jesus, right? And he addresses him, and what do they say?
Crucify him.
And who are the they?
The people.
The people. Wow. So the people have done what?
Turned on
They have now taken sides. Okay, so what does Pilate do for a third time? He did it once, he did it twice. What does he do a third time?
What crime has he done?
Yeah, what crime has he done? Let me flog him and then
Let him go.
Turn him
release
loose.
him. Now, why would Pilate do it 3 times?
3.
3, holy number, complete number. 3 represents completion. So this is Pilate's exonerated, right? It isn't his fault. What happens when he does it a third time?
Sentenced him.
Okay. Now they yell even more. What does Pilate ends up doing? Gave the verdict that they wanted, releases the guy, hands Jesus over again. Hands Jesus over. So he's passing him on. Now, the washing of the hands is going to be in John. That's the Gospel of John where he washes hands. Which, again, even takes it a step further. Pilate is pure from this. He's cleansed. Pilate's innocent. Herod's innocent of the crucifixion. Jesus is crucified because of the scribes and Pharisees. That's why he dies on a Roman cross. It explains it here. Luke explains it here. What else do we know about Jesus as he's going on to this cross? Now, we know that he's the Christ. We know he's the Son of God. We also know...
Somebody else is carrying the cross for him?
Well, not yet, you're right. Has he been guilty of anything they've accused him of being? Nothing. So we know that Jesus is innocent. He's the one that's obeyed. He's been obeying the law. He's been following the law. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, but he's innocent. Innocence is a big deal in Luke. Okay, he's being taken away. What ends up happening?
A man.
Okay,
Simon.
as they leave, they seize a man. Boy, talk about a guy being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Simon, who is coming there. Why would Simon be there? Passover, right? He's there from out of town, Cyrene, that's North Africa. He's there. What do they make Simon do? Okay, makes Simon carry the cross. Behind Jesus. Thank you, Debbie, because that sounds kind of interesting. He's carrying the cross behind Jesus. That's giving me deja vu. The way Luke has chosen to word that, I'm experiencing deja vu. Did anybody ever talk about taking up a cross and following? Yeah. Who said that?
Jesus.
Jesus did. What did he say that was an example of?
Servant.
Servant or discipleship. That's what he said disciples do. They do what Simon is doing. So Simon, and it doesn't appear that here that Jesus, you see in movies, Jesus carrying a cross, collapses, they get Simon from the crowd, carries. In this, it doesn't seem to be the case. Doesn't seem that Jesus ever carries it, right? That Simon, when they hand him over, when Jesus is about to go, they get Simon to carry the cross. Now, it's really interesting when you compare this, and we get this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When you compare it to John, there's a lot of things different in John. And this is one of the differences. In John it says Jesus carried the cross alone. Because Jesus does all of it alone. He doesn't get any help for John. That's big deal in John. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Simon carries the cross for Jesus. Okay. So he's carrying these, so he's displaying what discipleship really is, taking up a cross and carrying it. Who else is there?
Great number of people.
Oh, you have a great number of people. And what are these people? What do we know about this great number?
They're following Jesus.
They are followers. Now, again, this is a difference in Luke. Because Luke has got, Jesus is not dying alone, right? He's carrying the cross and he's got supporters with him. If you read this in Mark, Jesus is alone. He is alone. And that's why in Mark, and at the cross he's alone. That's why in Mark it makes a lot of sense that Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because everybody else has. And now from the cross, Jesus believes God has as well. He won't say that in Luke. That's not going to be what Jesus says. Okay, so he is taking this, and what are the people? In fact, what are the people who are there? The followers are doing while Jesus is walking ahead of Simon. What are the people doing?
The women are crying.
The women are crying.
Beating their chests.
Wow, what's ironic that the women are crying? That the women.
They're going to be the first to.
Well, remember, Jesus cried too over Jerusalem when he came to the city. Remember, he wept over Jerusalem. What does Jesus say to the women who are crying?
He calls them daughters of Jerusalem.
Calls them daughters of Jerusalem and tells them not to weep for him. Why should they not weep for him? Who should they be weeping for?
Themselves and their children.
They should be weeping for themselves and their children. Why should they be weeping for themselves and their children?
Because the day will come when they'll say, blessed are the barren women that never bore. And
Bad times are coming, right? Bad times are coming. When will these bad times come for the women of Jerusalem? The year 71, when the Romans are going to tear the temple down during the rebellion. You know, this is, so in a sense, this is something that Luke's church knew had happened, because it happened 20 years before, and this is in now the mouth of Jesus. Jesus is saying this to them. Okay. And who else is with it? Not only do we have crowds and women crying and weeping and wailing and all stuff, we got two criminals. Now the fact that they're called criminals, as soon as we see that they are criminals, we know that they are guilty. Very good. Luke doesn't want us to see them as innocent at all. Okay, where do they go?
Golgotha.
They go to Golgotha, the place called the Skull. And that's a hill right outside of Jerusalem. Now, why would they crucify him on a hill?
They won't be able to see.
Visibility. And it says they crucified it, and the crucifixion here is really very brief, what they do. Because he could have gone into detail, right? What was crucifixion?
long, painful.
Long and
Suffering.
painful. And the Romans did it a lot. I mean, they crucified a lot. You drive the nails through the wrist, not through the hand, because it's too easy to get off of the cross if it's through your hands. So they would have driven it through the wrist, and it was intended to keep you against the cross, keep you there. They didn't want you bleeding out. That would be too fast.
So why, when Thomas sees him, does he have to look for the?
Well, evidently that's part of the tradition, but whether he was looking at the holes in the wrist. But the hands you wouldn't have, because that would have been too easy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, to tear.
But, I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what they specifically
Yeah,
say.
that's what it says in John. But the crucifixion would have been through the wrist, would have tied him up too. You know, you wouldn't trust, and you didn't want to go forward because you'd go into shock, you'd suffocate, and it was long and painful. So he's there at the crucifixion. How does Jesus respond? Yeah.
I'm sorry. I read this book and it came back to crucifixion and what you were talking about, where it just says he's crucified. And it's Andy Stanley, but he writes that no details were needed because most of Luke's first century readers had seen a crucifixion or aftermath of one, or knew someone who could describe it if they were interested. We've never witnessed crucifixion or stoning, we've only imagined. So it was like a known. The horror of it was well known.
Right, and it didn't need to go into detail.
Yeah, but for us, it kind of loses, you know.
It does. And I think that one of the things we have to be careful, especially after the Passion of the Christ, is the evangelists, the Gospels, kind of de-emphasize the suffering. I mean, they could have emphasized the ones that do have the scourging, the flogging, could have gone into great detail with it. But they don't. You know, they'll say he was flogged. He was crucified. They didn't go into the bloody details of it, which may indicate that they don't want us to be distracted by the pain. They want us to focus on something else. There's also, and that's a great point, people in the first century would have known that
That's interesting, a little shorthand, like they're like, oh yeah.
Yeah. And that's why the scourging, you know, you see Passion of the Christ, the scourging, and flesh is flying, and, you know, oh, it's horrible. It wouldn't have been. Because the last thing the Romans wanted was to whoop him to death. He had to die on a cross. They didn't want to beat him to death. That would have defeated the whole purpose of the crucifixion. Crucifixion was to deter people from messing with Rome. You didn't want it to get out with just dying as a result of a scourging. So anyway, so he's on a cross. What does Jesus do in Luke? What's the first thing he does in Luke?
The first thing Jesus does.
What's the first? He is crucified, between two criminals in Luke, and this is unique in Luke. What is the first thing Jesus does?
Father, forgive them.
He prays. The first thing he does on the cross is he prays.
They don't know what they're doing.
Okay. He prays and asks that God forgive. Now, why does that? Now, like I said, we don't have that in the others. Why? What is that showing about, at least how Luke is viewing Jesus?
It's again placing the blame where Luke wants it to be and not on the people that did the act.
Okay.
That did the literal act, but the people that passed the sentence,
Okay.
so to speak, maybe is a better way to say it.
So we got the same thing kind of going on. Now, while he's praying, what are they doing?
Dividing up his
They're
garments.
dividing up his clothes. And I think there's no accident that that's a contrast. Jesus is praying for them, and what are they doing?
They're still taking.
They're dividing up his clothes. Okay. Now, what are the people doing?
It says the leaders are scoffing.
Okay, now the leaders are scoffing, right? The leaders are scoffing. What are the people doing? They're just watching. Again, this is a little thing in Luke. You know, in Matthew and Mark, the people are scoffing. They're making fun of him, mocking him. That's not the case in Luke. The people are they're just watching. They're just there. Yes, but who is pushing this? Again, the leaders, right? They're the ones that are continually pushing this. Luke doesn't want us to lose sight of who is really to blame for this, right? Who else is mocking?
Well, the soldiers.
Soldiers are
Even the
mocking.
Jews.
And they offer they talk to, if you're king of the Jews, save yourself, and they offer him sour wine. Now, in the other Gospels, there's a little more about the sour wine. That was wine mixed with gall and opioid.
I thought myrrh was in it.
Yeah, and that's always it's an opioid, and what it's intended to do is kill some of the pain, so you don't go into shock. So they drugged you a little bit to deaden some of the pain because they wanted you there for days. They wanted you moaning for days. Now, what does Pilate though put? What do we see? The soldiers mock him and say, "King of the Jews," right? Mm-hmm. Now, why is that appropriate? Why is that appropriate? What they're saying, again, a little bit of irony. Why is that appropriate that they're saying, calling him King of the Jews?
Because he is a king.
Because he is a King of the Jews, and that he's saying, "Save yourself
And us.
Yeah. Well, why is that ironic? Because that's what he's going to do, right? Okay. Now, who else is mocking? So we've got the leaders mocking him, we've got soldiers mocking him. Who else mocks him? Who else mocks him?
I don't see anybody else mocking him.
Verse 39.
It's criminals.
Okay. You got criminals, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
They just want to be saved too.
Well, are both of the criminals?
Just one.
Only one of them. Now, a little different because in the other Gospels it's both of them. But here, only one of them, right? And in fact, what does the other one say?
Save yourself.
Well, one wants Jesus to save them as well. But they're doing it mocking. They're mocking him. What does the other one say?
Don't you fear God? Because we're like under condemnation, it says, which means they're guilty.
Right.
We're getting what we deserve.
But
this man's done nothing.
Has nothing wrong. Again, this innocent theme coming up, that Jesus is innocent. Now, what then does he say to Jesus?
Remember me when you come into your kingdom.
What is the criminal asking then? What is he doing when he says that?
Salvation, guilt,
Okay,
for forgiveness and salvation.
Okay, that's what he's thinking. Now, Luke is the only one that has this. How is this consistent with one of the themes we've talked about in Luke? A theme right from the beginning of Luke is big deal in Luke. What's going to happen in the kingdom of God? How is the kingdom of God going to be different than the kingdom of the world, than the living in the
paradise.
world? Well, it's going to be paradise. What's going to occur? Mary sang it.
The last will be first.
The last will be first, the first will be last. The powerful will be brought down from their thrones, the lowly lifted up. Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. The rich man is being tormented in Hades. It's this reversal, right? And right at the crucifixion, we've got another sign of this reversal, that even now a criminal is going to be forgiven, is going to be lifted up, Now he says, today you're going to be with me in paradise, but he's not talking about 24-hour day. What's he talking about with day?
Eternity.
Remember, I told you one of the things that's really important in a Jewish work, which includes the gospel and all the letters of Paul, is the resurrection is a big deal. Because the Jews believed that paradise would be the result of the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in what Gentiles saw as heaven. Heaven with disembodied souls. That's not what the Jews believed. They believed in a resurrection, like it says in Revelation. Resurrection, new heaven and a new earth. That's paradise. And so when he says day, he's talking about the day of resurrection, which is going to start when?
When he comes.
3 days after this. the period of resurrection is going to begin. That day is going to start when he's raised, the day of resurrection. It may take thousands of years, but the day of resurrection is beginning. Okay? So that's what I think he's talking about, not a 24-hour day, because Jesus is going to be in the ground, he ain't going to heaven and come back down, or heaven, he ain't doing that, so it's this day of resurrection I think he's talking about. Now, what happens, but it's a reversal. This criminal is now being received into paradise. What happens at noon?
It goes dark.
Okay, it gets really dark. And the sun fails, and what else happens? The curtain in the temple is torn in two. Now, what curtain are we talking about?
The Holy of Holies.
Separating
The inner, where God is present, from the outer, where people can hang out. Now, it's really kind of interesting that this is happening now. Because this is happening before something else.
Resurrection.
Well, not only before resurrection, but before what hasn't occurred yet.
His death.
He hasn't died yet, right? Because he's not going to die until after this happens. Something else unique in Luke. That Luke, instead of Matthew and Mark have this occurring after he dies, Luke has it before. Okay? So Luke views this crucifixion in a slightly different way than the other two. What does Jesus do before he died?
Father, I would just put myself in your hands.
Father, I put myself in your hands. To you I commend my spirit. How in the Gospel of Luke does Jesus die? If those are his last words, right? Mm-hmm. And then he breathes his last. How does Jesus die in the Gospel of Luke?
Praising God.
He dies praising God, right? He dies with faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does he die in Matthew and Mark? What's his last words in Matthew and Mark? His last words. Take a guess. My God, why have you forsaken me? What's the difference between, to you, Father, into your hands I commend your spirit, and my God, why have you forsaken me?
Well, it's not having the faith there.
There's one in Matthew, he doesn't die with faith. He dies questioning. Almost like, in agony.
Why'd you leave me
Are
behind?
you
Right.
really real?
Right. In the other one, he's dying with great faith and confidence. Remember, we're not talking here. We're talking about a gospel that reflects who Jesus is. Matthew and Mark want to emphasize that Jesus is like us. And so Jesus felt absolute and total fear, because who feels fear? Everybody does. And so Jesus dies in Matthew like us. So we can identify with him, he can identify with us. Evidently, that's not what Luke wants. That's not the point Luke is trying to make here. He doesn't want us to necessarily identify with Jesus. Or maybe he's giving Jesus as an example that maybe we can follow. But Luke is not nearly as interested in Jesus being like us, dying like we die. And remember, Jesus isn't dying alone, because there are people there. And so Jesus dies after saying this, and he can't say both, because you're going in two different directions. You can't say, I'm dying with faith, but I don't know why you abandoned me. So we're talking about how these evangelists are shaping the story to make the points they're making. Luke's point in the crucifixion is not this identification. In fact, we also see that with the centurion. What does the centurion say? What happens with the centurion?
Surely he was the Son of God, a righteous man.
Yeah, what does he say? Yeah, good. You changed it. Why did you change it?
Because I read it in
Because you read it in Luke. Because when you read it in Matthew and Mark, the centurion says, truly he's the Son of God.
Oh, okay.
But that's not what he says.
Certainly he was a righteous man.
Certainly he was a righteous man. Righteous and innocent, both the same Greek word. You know, truly he was righteous. Truly he was innocent. Which means this isn't the way Jesus, for Luke, this isn't the definitive sign of him being the Son. In the Gospel of Mark, that's how the centurion sees it. It's the suffering that Jesus experiences that proves that he's the Son. In Matthew, it's a little more complicated. He dies, but then, you know, there are earthquakes and dead people start walking, and the centurion sees this. So it's a cosmic thing. But in Luke, the centurion ends up recognizing something that we've already known, right? That Jesus was innocent of the charges brought against him. That Jesus was innocent of breaking the law. Even Jesus' parents, remember? Way back at his birth. After he was born, what did they do? They took the baby to Jerusalem to perform the sacrifice that was required by the law. And then later, when he was older, went back to Jerusalem again, you know, because that's what you're supposed to do. Jesus was a righteous, innocent person. You know, he didn't deserve this. Okay? Now, this is what he was, a follower of the law. So was his family. Who else is present? Now we got all kinds of crowds present. And when they see what has taken place, what do?
Beat their breasts.
They beat their breasts as they leave. Okay. Matthew and Mark, Jesus is alone. He is alone. That's why he feels God forsaken him, because he is true. He dies alone. He can identify with us. Here, Jesus isn't dying alone. He's dying with faith, with great faith. Who else is there? So we've got the crowds leave, they're beating their chests. Now the crowds have shifted again. You know, now they're not shouting for his crucifixion, they're beating their breasts as they leave. Who else is there? In 49. You got a bunch of women, right? And Luke tells us what about these women?
They're the ones who followed him.
They followed him all the way from Galilee. And where are they standing? At a distance. Jesus is dead. Who is introduced?
Joseph,
Okay, now we got Joseph. And how was he described?
a member of the council.
He's a member of the council. What else about him?
He didn't agree.
He is good and righteous, which is the same Greek word that the centurion just used to describe Jesus. Dikaios, the same Greek word. So he is righteous. He didn't agree with what they were doing, which shows what? That he has some kind of faith, right? That not all Jews are bad. Not all Jews are bad. Who is bad? Scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests. But Simon is not, or Joseph is not bad, right? We had another Jew that wasn't bad. Simon wasn't bad, right? You know? So, and in fact, Simeon, what does it say that Joseph is waiting for? He's waiting for the kingdom of God, right? Just like Simeon at the birth, he was waiting for the kingdom of God. Okay? So some Jews are good, which may tell us a little bit about Luke's community. That it wasn't an all Gentile community. It was a community that had Jewish Christians too. So he isn't trashing all Jews. In the Gospel of John, the enemy isn't the scribes and the Pharisees. The enemies are the Jews. What does Joseph do?
Asks for the body.
Takes the body. What does he do with the body?
Wraps it in linen.
Okay, and then?
Puts it in a hand-hewed tomb.
Okay, in a tomb in which no one has
Ever been.
ever been. When did all this happen?
Well,
Right before the Sabbath.
Okay, before the Sabbath. And who had come when they did this?
the women.
The women. And with what did they return? What did they have?
They were gonna spice
They
them
had
up.
spices and ointments. And what did they do?
Rested on the Sabbath.
They rested on the Sabbath. My goodness gracious, even these women are obedient to the law. They're resting, doing what the law commands. They are following the law as well. You know, this is the crucifixion in Luke, which is different than, if you want to read the crucifixion in the other Gospels, because it's slightly different, which shows that the different evangelists want to present a different picture of who Jesus is. Which one is right and which one is wrong? They're all right, because they're presenting different pictures of who Jesus is. They're not presenting history, they're presenting story that reveals his identity. Okay? Now, from this point, what's going to happen in the next chapter? What are we going to see in chapter 24? We're going to have him arrive. We're going to have a resurrection in chapter 24. But remember, Luke has another volume, so he doesn't have to conclude the story in chapter 24. He can do it in Acts, and he can carry it over in Acts, and that's sort of what we're going to see a little bit. Okay? Any questions? The crucifixion is really interesting. Especially when you compare the different stories and allow each story to speak, instead of kind of trying to fit it into a framework that makes us comfortable. Let the story speak, and let's find out who Jesus is. He was, he can identify with us. He's also innocent and righteous. He also came to do a job, which is kind of the way John sees it. In John, his last words are, "It is finished," because it is. His work is done. He's ready to go home, and that's what we see in John. Okay, let's have a word of prayer and then go home. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Bless us as we consider who your Son was, who our Savior is, and help us as he faced death. Help us to trust in you when we face the trials we face. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.